7:42 a.m., March 14th, 1941. Cold air dragged across the tarmac of RAF Kenley, carrying the bitter tang of high-octane fuel. A Hurricane fighter idled at dispersal, its 12-cylinder heart snarling against the morning mist. Standing 30 feet away, arms folded inside her leather coat, Beatrice Schilling watched a young pilot climb into the cockpit. His name was Squadron Leader John Davies, 24 years old, 41 combat sorties, 3 confirmed kills, 2 near deaths caused not by enemy fire, but by his own engine. The sky above southern England was a blur of grey and gunmetal. The Channel lay invisible behind the haze, but everyone on this airfield knew what waited across it. Luftwaffe wings, black crosses flashing like teeth. That week alone, 43 Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds had crossed the Channel. 27 dogfights had erupted. 14 Hurricanes and 9 Spitfires had failed to come home. The pattern was brutal, mathematical, and always the same. British pilot spots German fighter. British pilot dives to attack. Engine cuts out. German pilot escapes or circles back and finishes the kill. Schilling had read every report. She'd seen the wreckage. She'd spoken to pilots who'd wrestled dying engines in a sky that gave no second chances. The diagnosis was clear. Carburetor flooding under negative. G. Simple physics. Fatal consequence. When a Spitfire or Hurricane pushed into a steep dive, gravity reversed. Fuel surged to the top of the float chamber. The jet starved. The engine coughed, then died 1.5 seconds of silence at 300 miles per hour. That single heartbeat of stillness gave a Messerschmitt all the time it needed to close in, to spit 20mm shells through aluminum skin and human bone. The Germans didn't suffer this failure. Their Daimler-Benz DB 601 engines ran on direct fuel injection, no floats, no flooding, no hesitation. A German pilot could roll, dive, or invert without losing power. In the geometry of dogfighting, that was everything, and it was killing Britain. Beatrice Schilling knew the problem intimately. For 6 years, she had worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, the secret brain of British aviation. She knew carburetors like a surgeon knows arteries, how fuel pulsed through brass, how air mixed with vapor to form controlled combustion. But now her field of study was bleeding men dry. She was 32, small-framed, dark-haired, with eyes sharpened by logic. In the engine department, she was one of 2 women. Her title, Principal Technical Officer, Carburetor Research Division. Her mission, keep pilots alive. But 11 months had passed since the failure first appeared, and still there was no field solution. Rolls-Royce engineers were designing a pressure carburetor, a complete redesign of the Merlin's fuel system, perfect on paper, useless in war. It wouldn't be ready until 1943. The Luftwaffe wouldn't wait that long. That morning at Kenley, Schilling wasn't a name in a report. She was here, on the freezing concrete, carrying a brass disc, no larger than a coin, a part that might decide whether Davies lived or died before noon. She hadn't come for ceremony. She'd come to gamble her career on a theory. But 11 months had passed since the failure first appeared, and still there was no field solution. Rolls-Royce engineers were designing a pressure carburetor, a complete redesign of the Merlin's fuel system, perfect on paper, useless in war. It wouldn't be ready until 1943. The Luftwaffe wouldn't wait that long. That morning at Kenley, Schilling wasn't a name in a report. She was here, on the freezing concrete, carrying a brass disc no larger than a coin, a part that might decide whether Davies lived or died before noon. She hadn't come for ceremony. She'd come to gamble her career on a theory. She had read his file. Engine failures in February and March, both during dives, both survived by luck and altitude. Each time, he'd wrestled gravity itself, while the Messerschmitt behind him kept firing. Each time, the Merlin came back to life, just a second too late. Today, that second wouldn't exist. Inside her satchel was the restrictor, a small brass washer she'd machined by hand. A hole drilled through its center, precisely 0.04 inches in diameter. Nothing elegant, nothing heroic. Just a calculated choke point in the fuel line. Limit flow during -G. Prevent flooding. The Merlin would keep breathing through the dive. If it worked. If it didn't, Davies would die, and her name would vanish into the wreckage reports. The wind sharpened. Schilling watched the mechanic step back from the hurricane. Davies signaled for clearance. The propeller spun to a blur. The sound swelled until it was less an engine than a roar of defiance. The aircraft rolled forward, tail lifting, wheels skimming mud. Then it rose, dragging dust into the air like ghosts of the pilots who hadn't returned. 800 feet, 1,200, 2,000. Schilling raised her binoculars. The hurricane banked south, climbing toward the invisible channel. Two more followed, forming the standard three-plane section. They vanished into the horizon, where the light and cloud folded into one another. Silence fell. The kind of silence that only exists on airfields during war, crowded, mechanical, but hollow underneath. Schilling stood beside Sergeant William Cooper, a ground engineer who'd installed the restrictor without authorization. He had seen 19 pilots die from engine failures. He hadn't asked questions when she'd shown him the part that morning. He just welded it into the fuel line and said, "Let's hope this one breathes better than the last." Now they waited. 40 minutes. No radio. No word. Each second a coin flipped between life and death. The carburetor problem had started back in July 1940, when the RAF switched to 100-octane fuel. The higher grade let Merlin engines push to 1,310 horsepower, nearly 200 more than before. That boost helped Spitfires catch Messerschmitts in level flight. But it also pushed the carburetors to the edge of physics. More power meant more fuel flow. More fuel meant more chance for flooding. The Skinner's Union, SU carburetor, once flawless in peacetime flight, now betrayed its pilots in combat. A design flaw turned into a death sentence. Schilling had known it from the first crash report. She'd tested every variable: float angle, jet clearance, chamber volume. Every experiment ended the same way. Inverted fuel surge, engine stall, silence. So she'd gone back to basics. Forget redesign, forget bureaucracy, think like gravity. Gravity didn't care about paperwork. She'd imagined the inside of the carburetor during a dive, the fuel slamming upward, overwhelming the jet. Then the question formed, what if the fuel simply couldn't surge fast enough to flood? A restrictor. One disc, one aperture. Control the flood by limiting the rush. The idea was absurd in its simplicity, elegant in its mathematics. Too large, and the Merlin still drowned. Too small, and the engine starved. She'd built 17 prototypes before finding the ratio that matched airflow, fuel pressure, and engine demand at full boost. It wasn't genius, it was persistence, metal patience. The kind that builds bridges and saves pilots. But she needed proof. Bench tests weren't enough. Gravity doesn't follow lab rules. Only combat could decide. 9:37 a.m. The radio crackled. Control tower. 3 hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. Schilling's breath caught. 3 dark specks appeared in the sky, rolling in formation. She steadied the binoculars. All 3 planes intact. No smoke, no missing wings. Alive. Davies landed first. Tires screeched. The engine coughed once and fell quiet. He pulled off his helmet, climbed down, and walked toward the crew. He was smiling, something rare on fighter stations, where joy had been rationed out months ago. Sergeant Cooper met him halfway. "Any trouble with the Merlin, sir?" Davies shook his head. "Best it's ever run," he said. "Dove on 2 Messers over Dungeness. Engine never missed a beat." Schilling stepped closer, heart hammering like a piston. She asked for details: altitude, dive angle, G-load, throttle response. Davies recited them mechanically. 14,000 feet, 400 miles an hour, negative G for almost 2 seconds. He'd closed within 200 yards of the German before firing. Hits confirmed. The enemy spun away, trailing smoke. The Merlin hadn't stuttered. Not once. He wanted to know what she'd done to his machine. She told him the restrictor, the brass washer, the hole that let him live. Davies stared, silent for a moment. Then he turned to Cooper and barked, "Put that thing in every hurricane on this field. Today." Schilling hesitated. "It's not authorized." Davies grinned, thin and tired. "Neither is dying." By sunset, 5 hurricanes at Kenley flew with the restrictor installed. 0 failures. 12 successful diving attacks over the channel that week. The pattern, the deadly arithmetic, was broken. That night, Schilling sat in her quarters, the smell of engine oil still on her hands. Outside, anti-aircraft guns thudded in the distance. Inside, she replayed the moment Davies landed. The grin, the relief, the way his voice carried that faint disbelief of a man who'd survived by the grace of a machine he didn't understand. She thought of all the names on the casualty lists, all the pilots who never had that brass washer. Then she thought of the 1,000 engines still waiting for it. War wasn't about brilliance, it was about speed. Speed of thought, speed of courage. The Germans had theirs in fuel injection. Britain had just found theirs in a woman on a motorcycle carrying a satchel full of brass. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had shaped metal, not lives, but somehow both. Tomorrow she would ride north, Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, Tangmere, every Merlin engine she could reach. History would call it Miss Schilling's orifice. She didn't know that yet. All she knew was that for the first time, in 11 months, the Merlin had stayed alive when gravity tried to kill it. And somewhere above the grey channel, for the first time, a British pilot dove without fear. Before the roar of engines and brass washers saving lives, there was only noise, metal, oil, and disbelief. Before Miss Schilling's orifice became a legend whispered in hangars, there was Tilly, a woman with a wrench in a man's war. She was 14 when she bought her first machine, a battered Norton motorcycle, leaking oil and defying repair. She dragged it through mud, boots sinking, wind cutting across Hampshire fields. Inside her family's kitchen, she laid its parts out on the floor like a surgeon preparing for an operation. Piston, carburetor, gasket, valve, each one cleaned, labeled, understood. When the Norton roared to life 3 days later, the sound shook the house and rewired her soul. That engine didn't just run, it obeyed. Years later, she'd chase that same feeling at Brooklands, Britain's temple of speed. Men in leather helmets laughed when she rolled her bike to the start line. They stopped laughing when she hit 106 miles per hour and took home the gold star. Only 3 women ever earned it. She was the second. Speed had no gender, and Tilly Schilling never asked for permission to prove it. By 1939, speed turned into war. Britain needed engineers who could think faster than the bombs falling over Europe. She joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, the brain of British aviation, where equations became weapons. The hangars smelled of gasoline and cold steel. Men shouted over roaring engines, sparks lighting the concrete like flares. When Tilly first walked in, carrying her drafting case and a calm expression, the noise dropped. One mechanic laughed. "Lost your way to the typing pool, love." She ignored him, walked straight to the test rig, adjusted a Merlin carburetor with a 1/2-inch wrench, and corrected an airflow problem they'd fought with for 2 weeks. The engine steadied. The laughter didn't return. From that day, they learned to step aside when she approached. She wasn't the secretary. She was the reason the engines lived. Then came the reports, dry, typed pages soaked in blood. Pilot missing over Dover. Engine cut out in dive. Confirmed loss. In July 1940, after Britain switched to 100-octane fuel, the Merlin's power climbed from 1,100 to 1,310 horsepower. The Spitfire and Hurricane became predators until gravity betrayed them. -G, 1.5 seconds of silence. Engines stalled, fighters became gliders, and young men vanished into the channel. Schilling watched the graphs rise and the casualty lists rise faster. The physics mocked her. Fuel surged upward during a dive, drowning the carburetor's jet. The Germans didn't suffer this fate. Their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection. No floats, no flooding, no fear. Every time a Merlin died, she felt the equation twist inside her chest. The numbers weren't just data anymore, they were names. By January 1941, she'd spent 11 months testing theories, 12-hour days under the roar of engines, notebooks filled with dead ends. Then, one night, she found it not in inspiration, but in exhaustion. It was past midnight. Rain rattled against the tin roof of the test hangar. A carburetor lay open before her, under the light of a single lamp. She sketched a line, then another. Her pencil trembled. Fuel surged here too much, air here too little. She whispered to herself, what if it never had the chance to flood? The idea struck like lightning. Not a new design, not a miracle, just control. A brass restrictor, a simple washer, inserted before the carburetor to limit fuel flow during negative G. She made it herself on a lathe in the corner, cutting metal at dawn, sparks spilling like rain. Diameter, 0.125 inches. Central hole, 0.04 inches. She drilled 17 versions before one worked. The engine screamed under test, inverted, and Miracle kept breathing. 1.5 seconds of survival. 1.5 seconds to turn defeat into attack. 1.5 seconds to save a pilot's life. But the Air Ministry didn't want simplicity. They wanted signatures, committees, clearance stamps. Tilly brought her data fuel curves, pressure graphs, flow rates, and laid them on the table. The officers glanced once and said, unauthorized modification. We'll revisit after the Rolls-Royce redesign. After 1943. Maybe. She walked out without saluting. Outside, snow fell across the Farnborough runway, white over black tarmac. She looked up, jaw set. The war will not wait, she said to no one. So she broke the rules. On March 14th, 1941, dawn cut through fog like a blade. She packed 6 restrictors into a leather satchel, slung it across her shoulder, and wheeled her Norton out of the hangar. The guard at the gate looked at her papers, then at the dark road beyond. Where to, miss? Kenley, she said, tightening her gloves. He hesitated. That's a combat station. So is every sky above this island, she answered, and twisted the throttle. The Norton roared, dragging dust down the frozen road. Wind whipped her scarf as she rode south, past convoys of trucks, searchlights slicing fog, soldiers staring at the woman on a motorcycle racing into war. Behind her, the factories burned midnight oil. Ahead, the front line waited. By the time she reached RAF Kenley, the sun was a dull red smear on the horizon. She found Sergeant William Cooper, a mechanic she trusted. He'd seen 19 pilots die from the same failure. She showed him the brass washer, shining faintly in the cold. No paperwork, she said, just results. Cooper looked at it, then nodded. Let's save some lives. They installed the first restrictor into Squadron Leader Davies' Hurricane. A single weld, 60 seconds, invisible once finished. By the book, it was treason against engineering protocol. By the clock, it was salvation. That flight would prove everything. That story would be told in... But the real story began not in the sky, but in the silence after. When Davies landed smiling, when he said the words, "Best the Merlins ever run," Schilling didn't celebrate. She went back to the math, the flow rate, the G-load, the silence in her head filled with the hum of engines reborn. Within 72 hours, the news spread. By March 18th, 14 squadrons had requested the modification. By March 25th, the Air Ministry called it a war-winning device. Rolls-Royce was ordered to manufacture 500 restrictors a week. The RAF called it Miss Schilling's orifice. Crude humor, but it stuck. She didn't mind. If laughter helped pilots trust her work, she'd take it. Now she rode again, Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, Tangmere, 40 airfields in 20 days. She carried restrictors in her satchel and faith in her chest. Every installation took 12 minutes. Every test flight meant another pilot returned home. No engineers died. Not one. By April, the statistics turned like the tide. Engine failures in diving attacks dropped from 38% to 0.4%. The kill-to-loss ratio rose from 1.3 to 3.2. The Luftwaffe began reporting improved British performance in negative G combat. A 50-cent washer had rewritten air warfare. Schilling didn't slow down. Farnborough sent telegrams asking her to report back. She ignored them. Instead, she slept in hangars, ate with ground crews, checked every weld herself. She worked 12 hours, rode 6 more, and still wrote test notes by candlelight. At one base, a young pilot handed her his lucky charm, a small silver coin, and said, "You're the reason I'm still flying." She pocketed it silently. For the first time, she believed she might actually win against gravity itself. When the ministry finally summoned her to London, she arrived in her oil-stained coat, hair windswept, eyes fierce. They offered formal commendation and a desk position. She refused both. "Desk work doesn't keep pilots alive," she said. Then she turned back toward her motorcycle. History would remember what happened next. How she carried her satchel north. How ground crews welded brass into every Merlin engine across Britain. How a woman's quiet defiance bought a nation its breath back. But that was still to come. In the moment, there was only the black and white roar of war, the hum of machines she had taught to live, and the faint glimmer of brass under English rain. Dawn crawled over RAF Kenley, grey and heavy, the kind of morning when the war felt older than the world. Frost clung to the wings of the hurricanes, lined along the dispersal pad. Mechanics moved like ghosts through the mist boots, crunching, breath white in the cold. Beatrice Tilly Schilling stood alone at the edge of the tarmac, leather coat buttoned to the neck, her satchel still stained from the road. The brass restrictor inside had already changed one hurricane. Now it had to change everything. She watched Squadron Leader Davies climb into his cockpit, goggles down, gloves tight. He looked calm, too calm, the kind of calm you see in men who've already buried their fear. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and burning avgas. A mechanic shouted something lost to the wind. Then the sound came, a sharp, rising scream as the Merlin engine fired, its 12 pistons snarling against gravity itself. It was 7:42 a.m., March 14th, 1941. In 30 seconds, the machine would either prove her right or kill a man trying to save his country. The ground shook. Davies' Hurricane rolled forward, wheels hissing over wet gravel, the propeller slicing mist into ribbons. Schilling felt the vibration in her chest, the drumbeat of combustion and belief. She had done this, altered this engine, rewired its hunger. As the aircraft lifted off, she held her breath. The moment stretched. 3 hurricanes climbed into the clouds, their silhouettes swallowed by fog. Then silence. She stood with Sergeant Cooper, the mechanic who'd welded the restrictor in place. He was older, eyes lined by oil and fatigue, a man who'd seen too many coffins draped in flags. "No radio yet," he muttered. Schilling said nothing. She was doing math in her head. Fuel flow at 12 pounds per square inches, altitude 14,000 feet, negative G duration 1.5 seconds. The numbers were perfect. The war was not. 40 minutes passed. No word. A hawk circled above the field, alone against the fog. Somewhere over the channel, men were fighting, burning, falling. At 9:37, the control tower crackled. 3 hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. The words hit like lightning. Schilling grabbed her binoculars. Over the tree line, 3 dots emerged, steady, level, alive. She felt her pulse hammer. The first hurricane touched down, tires screeching, propeller slowing to a whisper. Davies climbed out, helmet under his arm, face smeared with oil and smiling. That smile didn't belong on a man who'd just seen combat. It belonged on someone who'd seen a ghost and realized it wasn't his. "Any trouble with the Merlin, sir?" Cooper asked. Davies wiped his face with a glove. "Best it's ever run," he said. "Dove on 2 messes over Dungeness engine, never missed a beat." Schilling stepped closer. "Negative. G dive. Full," he said. 400 miles an hour. Should have died twice over, but she just kept breathing. He turned to her, eyes narrowing. "What did you do to my hurricane?" She told him the restrictor, the brass washer, the flow limitation that starved the flood without starving the engine. Davies stared for a heartbeat. Then he barked, "Put that thing in every hurricane on this field today." Schilling hesitated. "It's not authorized." Davies grinned. "Neither is dying." By sunset, 6 hurricanes carried her invention. By nightfall, they flew their first patrol. No engines failed. 0. The next morning, the base commander called from his office. "Miss Schilling," he said, "I hear you've been altering my aircraft." She expected a reprimand. Instead, he poured her a cup of tea. "Whatever you did, it works. I lost 19 men in 6 months to that damned carburetor. I'm done losing any more." He raised the cup in salute. "You'll have your brass, as much as you need." The news spread like fire through wet grass. By March 18th, 11 group headquarters knew. By March 20th, every squadron commander from Biggin Hill to Hornchurch was calling Farnborough, demanding the washer. Some pilots refused to fly without it. Others risked court-martial to install it themselves. At RAF Tangmere, a young engineer scribbled in his logbook, "New device fitted Miss Schilling's restrictor. Engine flawless. Dove on enemy no stall. God bless whoever made it." Rolls-Royce was ordered to begin production. Output: 6 restrictors per week. Installation time: 12 minutes per aircraft. Result: 0 fuel starvation in -G maneuvers. It wasn't just engineering, it was arithmetic turned into salvation. Each washer cost 50 cents to produce. Each one could buy a pilot his life back. Tilly rode her Norton motorcycle across England, leather satchel full of restrictors clanking against her hip. Fog, rain, blackouts, none of it mattered. She visited Biggin Hill, North Weald, Tangmere, Hawkin, 40 airfields in 20 days. She supervised installations personally. No brass washer left her hand untested. She watched mechanics disconnect fuel lines, weld the restrictor, seal it, run the engine to full power. The roar was always the same, a machine reborn, hunger disciplined. When the pilots asked her name, she just said, "Tilly." When they thanked her, she nodded once and moved on. The pilots, of course, gave it a nickname, Miss Schilling's Orifice. Crude, childish, perfect. It spread faster than the restrictor itself. RAF humor was always a mask for fear, and if laughter kept them flying, she'd take it. Within a month, 2,100 Merlin engines carried the modification. The Luftwaffe started noticing. After-action reports mentioned improved British diving attacks. Enemy fighters now able to sustain inverted maneuvers, one German officer wrote. Tactical advantage lost. A 50-cent washer had leveled the sky. April 1941. Fighter Command's numbers told the story. Before the restrictor, 38% of diving attacks ended in engine failure. Kill-to-loss ratio barely 1.3 to 1. After the restrictor, failures dropped to 0.4%. Kill-to-loss ratio surged to 3.2 to 1. The math was brutal and beautiful. Schilling's name wasn't on the reports, but her work was in every flight. Late one night, back at Farnborough, she stood by a test rig, the hum of engines vibrating through the hangar. The war outside was still raging, but in here, she'd won a small piece of it, a victory measured not in miles or medals, but in lives. She looked at her hands, stained with oil and frostbite, the hands of a mechanic, not a hero. Then she heard the words of one pilot echo in her memory. "You're the reason I'm still flying." She smiled, just once, because war rarely offered smiles. Beyond the hangar walls, thunder rolled across the night sky bombers heading out over France. She didn't need to look. She knew what sound a Merlin made when it was ready, and what sound it made when it wasn't. Now, it was ready. The war would go on, engines roaring, men dying, nations breaking, but from that day forward, no British pilot would lose his engine to gravity again. Schilling didn't ask for recognition. She didn't care about promotions or medals. What she cared about was the line on the flight log that read, "Returned safely." That was her signature. Invisible, indelible. The restrictor wasn't genius, it was discipline, faith, and a refusal to accept defeat. A brass circle no bigger than a coin had given back something priceless: trust. As April faded into May, and Britain held its breath for the next wave of war, one truth settled into history. Victory didn't always come from the sky. Sometimes it came from a workshop, a wrench, and a woman who believed that physics could bleed just like men and could be taught to stop. By April 1941, England was still burning, but now, at least, its engines breathed. The brass washer, Tilly Schilling's invention, small enough to balance on a fingertip, had crossed from experiment to weapon. And the Royal Air Force had stopped falling from the sky. Fog clung to the hangars at Biggin Hill, the busiest fighter station in No. 11 Group. Pilots called it Suicide Airfield, too close to France, too often the first to intercept the Luftwaffe. But on this grey morning, the air hummed with something new: confidence. Beatrice Schilling arrived before sunrise, her Norton motorcycle coughing smoke as it rolled over the cracked tarmac. Her coat was stiff with oil, her goggles frosted with cold. She carried a crate strapped to the back, 50 brass restrictors, hand-machined, each wrapped in brown paper like ammunition. The guard waved her through. Everyone at Biggin Hill had heard of the woman with the wrench. Some thought she was myth, others swore she'd saved their squadron. She parked beside Hangar 3, where ground crews were already working under floodlights. Engines idled, mechanics shouted over the noise. The smell of burned fuel and steel filled the dawn. Tilly stepped off the Norton, unstrapped the crate, and said the only words that mattered: "Let's get started." 4 mechanics surrounded the first Spitfire Mach 2, its Merlin engine still warm from yesterday's sortie. They drained the line, unscrewed the coupling, and slid the washer into place, a simple brass ring between life and death. Each installation took 12 minutes. She timed them with her wristwatch, the same one she'd used during the test at Kenley. Disconnect line, insert restrictor, weld, seal. "Next," she said. By noon, 4 aircraft were done. By dusk, 20. The process moved like clockwork, one aircraft after another, each one reborn. Captain James Lacey, a pilot with 40 combat missions, leaned against a toolbox, watching her work. "You really think that little washer changes everything?" he asked. She didn't look up. "I don't think, I know." Lacey smiled. "Then God bless simple physics." He climbed into his Spitfire and took off 10 minutes later, the roar of his engine splitting the haze. 2 hours later, radio crackled across the control tower. Enemy contact over Dover, 2 Messerschmitts destroyed, no engine failures. The room erupted. Someone shouted her name. Schilling just exhaled and looked toward the south. The brass washer worked again, another test, another life. The commander of Biggin Hill, Group Captain Grace, met her at the gate that evening. He'd lost 7 pilots in 2 months to the carburetor failure. He shook her hand, eyes hard. "You've just given us back the sky." By the end of April, every squadron in southern England was asking for the device. Telegrams flooded Farnborough. "Send Schilling and restrictors immediately." Rolls-Royce ramped up production, 500 a week, then 1,000. Every Merlin engine in Fighter Command was scheduled for modification. The Air Ministry called it a stopgap miracle. The pilots called it Miss Schilling's orifice. Tilly didn't care what they called it. She cared that it worked. She and her small team, 3 engineers, 2 civilian welders, toured the island like traveling surgeons. 40 RAF stations in 3 weeks. Rain, blackout, rationed fuel, bombed roads, they went anyway. She supervised every weld, inspected every line, rejected anything she couldn't trust. The war couldn't afford sloppy hands. Tangmere, Hornchurch, North Weald, Biggin Hill, hawking names that sounded like legend now, but back then they were just places where boys tried not to die. Everywhere she went, pilots crowded around her motorcycle as she unloaded the restrictors. Some stared in disbelief that salvation could fit in a matchbox. Others just said, "Thank you, ma'am," and walked away to fly again. She didn't ask for their gratitude. She didn't even ask their names. She only asked that they survive. Within 4 weeks, Fighter Command's combat reports changed tone. Before the restrictor, 38% of dive attacks ended in engine failure. After the restrictor, 0.4%. Numbers don't feel, but they tell truth. And the truth was this: the RAF was back in the fight. April 28, 1941. A squadron of Spitfires from Hornchurch intercepted 9 Messerschmitts over the Channel. The fight lasted 7 minutes. Every British aircraft returned. Not one engine failed. For the first time since the Battle of Britain began, the Luftwaffe didn't own the dive. German intelligence took notice. After-action reports described improved British diving capability and sustained engine performance under inverted conditions. The tactical advantage was gone. One brass washer had undone years of German engineering. At Farnborough, the official approval arrived, stamped in red. Standard equipment for all Merlin engines. It should have felt like triumph. It didn't. Schilling wasn't done. She knew the restrictor was a patch, not perfection. The pressure carburetor was still under development, a full redesign that would end the flooding problem forever. But it wouldn't be ready until 1943. Until then, her washer was the front line. That spring, she rode north into rain that never stopped. Her Norton threw up mud and smoke. Villagers waved from doorsteps as she passed no one, knowing the woman in goggles carried a weapon more powerful than any bullet. At Duxford, she met Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, one of Britain's top aces. He'd lost 4 engines to negative G dives before the modification. Now he could attack with abandon. He shook her hand with a grin. "I owe you 5 Germans," he said. She laughed for the first time in months. Then pay the debt. By May, Tuck had destroyed 5 more Messerschmitts, his confidence restored by a hole smaller than a grain of rice. Even in victory, Schilling worked like the war never ended. She sent progress reports, recalibrated restrictor specs, checked for performance losses at high altitude. She found none. Pilots even claimed the engines ran smoother at full boost. The RAF statistical report for May 1941 read, "Engine failure due to negative. G practically eliminated." Below it, a typed note, "Device developed by Beatrice Schilling." RAE. It was the only official recognition she received that year. She didn't frame it. She folded it into a notebook and kept working. One afternoon at Tangmere, she sat beside the runway, watching Spitfires lift through the haze. Their shadows stretched long across the concrete. She could feel the rumble of their takeoff in her ribs. For months, that sound had meant dread engines dying mid-dive, smoke spiraling down. Now it meant something else. It meant control, survival. The war still howled, but the RAF howled back. The restrictor spread beyond Fighter Command. Coastal Command wanted them for bow fighters. Bomber Command asked for them in trainers. Even the Fleet Air Arm requested versions for carrier aircraft. Schilling oversaw it all. Rolls-Royce increased output to 1,000 a week. By June 1941, more than 2,100 Merlin engines carried her design. New Spitfires rolled off the assembly line with the washer already installed standard issue, standard salvation. Late that summer, she returned to Farnborough for the first time in months. Her office was cold, papers piled high. On her desk sat a letter from the Air Ministry. "Your modification is hereby recognized as a war-winning contribution." She didn't smile. She turned off the lamp, walked back into the hangar, and listened to the engines. Outside, night bombers climbed into the sky, each one fed by the same principle she'd discovered in silence: control the flood, keep the fire alive. The war was far from over, but because of her, Britain's heart, its engines no longer stopped in fear. In the years ahead, the pressure carburetor would finally arrive, perfecting what her restrictor had begun. But the pilots never forgot her. Whenever a Spitfire dove and lived, her name echoed quietly through the radio static. "Tilly's still watching over us." History would call her device a temporary solution. But every pilot who came home knew better. They knew that a 50-cent washer born from brass and belief, had turned physics into armor and bought a nation the time it needed to fight another day. The war ended not with silence, but with the long sigh of engines finally cooling. By 1945, the world that had once been on fire was now smouldering, and in that smoke stood Beatrice "Tilly" Schilling, the woman who had saved the Royal Air Force with a washer the size of a coin. But history is cruel with memory. It keeps its spotlight on the aces and generals, not on the hands that kept their machines alive. When the Luftwaffe retreated and the skies above England cleared, Farnborough fell quiet. The test bays, once alive with noise and purpose, now echoed with absence. Engines that had once screamed for survival now waited for storage tags. Mechanics packed their tools. Pilots went home. Tilly stayed. The war had made her indispensable. Peace made her invisible. She returned to her small workshop at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, the same bench where she had first machined the brass restrictor years before. Her colleagues moved on to peacetime projects: jet propulsion, pressurized cockpits, swept wings. She kept her head down, sleeves rolled up, still chasing perfection in combustion and flow. That was how she lived, fed by belief, not applause. Britain was rebuilding. Its men came home, its cities did not. The factories of war shifted to cars and domestic engines, but Farnborough remained the laboratory of the impossible. New aircraft demanded answers to new problems: frozen fuel lines over Russia, thin air above 35,000 feet, and the terrifying silence of cold engines that refused to start in -40 degrees wind. Schilling was there always the first to volunteer for a challenge that killed lesser engineers. She helped design cold start systems for Spitfires, deployed to Murmansk, ensuring that even in the Arctic, British aircraft could claw their way into the sky. She researched mixture optimization at altitude, developing modifications that increased power by 8% above 30,000 feet. The work was invisible, unglamorous, and absolutely vital. In every bolt and gear, she left fingerprints no one would ever see. Her colleagues still doubted her. The old boys' club at Farnborough was hard to kill. Medals hadn't made them modern. They called her Miss Schilling, long after the war, never Engineer Schilling. When promotion committees met, her name was always the one left on the table. She didn't argue. She knew how men fought battles of ego and how women fought battles of endurance. She stayed where she was happiest: the test floor. The smell of burnt oil, the shriek of turbines, the hiss of cooling valves. This was her battlefield, her peace treaty, her cathedral. In 1948, the British government remembered her briefly. The King awarded her the Order of the British Empire, recognizing her exceptional service in the field of aeronautical engineering. She attended the ceremony at Buckingham Palace, wearing her best black dress and a smile she didn't mean. The medal glittered under chandeliers, but in her mind she was still standing at RAF Kenley, in the fog, watching a hurricane climb through the dawn on an engine she'd dared to alter. The next morning, she was back at Farnborough before sunrise, turning a wrench. That was her victory lap. Peace brought new machines. The piston engine gave way to the jet, and with it came a new frontier speed. Speed meant danger. Runways slick with rain became death traps. Braking systems failed. Pilots survived combat only to die on landing. So Schilling started again. She studied wet runway braking dynamics, measuring tire friction, water lift, and skid resistance. In 3 years, she produced a set of formulas still used, decades later, in aircraft safety testing. "Brakes kill more men than Messerschmitts," she once said dryly. At least Messerschmitts are polite enough to be German. But even as the nation raced ahead into jet-age glory, Tilly never chased headlines. While the RAF's new engineers courted the ministry, she stayed in the lab, sleeves rolled, pencil behind her ear, chalking equations on blackboards darkened by years of exhaust dust. Her voice remained steady, clipped, efficient. Her hands remained restless, scarred, certain. When asked once why she never sought promotion, she said, "If you're busy climbing ladders, you're not fixing engines." She was still racing, though not in the sky, but on the ground. On weekends, she rebuilt her 1934 Norton, the same motorcycle she'd ridden through war-torn England, to RAF bases. She stripped it bare, cleaned the carburetor by hand, and tuned it to perfection. Every ride was an act of memory. The sound of the engine reminded her of Merlin engines at full throttle, the same rhythm that had once drowned out the sound of gunfire. She'd lean into turns, wind in her face, the world flashing by in shades of black and silver. People stared at the old woman on the old machine. They didn't know they were watching the woman who'd once taught the RAF how to dive. By the 1950 seconds, Britain's heroes were jet pilots, not engineers. The press loved glamour, not grit. The Spitfire became legend, the Washer became trivia. Still, Schilling worked on. She joined the Blue Streak missile program, designing fuel systems for Britain's first ballistic rockets. When test pilots feared landing accidents, she built simulation rigs to study skid dynamics. Her notebooks filled with sketches and formulas, no pretense, no poetry, just precision. Her life was steady, measured in revolutions per minute. Then came the new generation young men. Fresh from universities, she'd once been barred from attending. They called her Mom out of habit, not respect. They didn't know what she'd done. They didn't know how many lives her brass washer had bought. But they listened when she spoke, because even time bowed to competence. She trained them anyway, quietly, patiently, teaching the same lesson over and over. The machine will forgive everything except arrogance. They didn't forget that. Her husband, George Naylor, returned from the war with scars he didn't speak of. He'd flown Lancaster bombers, survived 31 missions, earned a Distinguished Flying Cross, but never talked about it. They lived side by side, in mutual silence and deep respect, two engineers bound by the same machine-like discipline. Keep moving, keep fixing, never break down. When she rode, he watched. When he read, she built. It was a quiet love, the kind born in the shadow of war, sustained by habit, not confession. In 1969, at 60 years old, Tilly finally retired. 33 years of service. No fanfare, no farewell speech, just a handshake and a cardboard box of notebooks. She left Farnborough the same way she had arrived, riding her Norton into a grey morning. She spent her final years restoring old motorcycles and teaching mechanics in her garage. She called them my second war. Her hands never stopped working. She never stopped listening for the heartbeat of an engine that ran true. On November 18th, 1990, she passed away quietly at her home in Surrey, 81 years old, survived by her husband, her machines, and a legacy small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. The newspapers gave her a few paragraphs. Most mentioned only the nickname Miss Schilling's Orifice. No talk of courage, no mention of frostbitten mornings or the lives her design had saved. History reduced her to a joke it didn't understand. But legends have their own afterlife. In 2011, a pub in Farnborough was renamed the Tilly Schilling. In 2015, the Brooklands Museum displayed her gold star and her racing helmet, both restored to a quiet shine. In 2019, the Royal Holloway University opened the Beatrice Schilling Building for engineering students. And in every RAF museum, behind glass, sits a small brass washer. Simple. Perfect. Eternal. A reminder that war isn't just fought by the men in cockpits, but by the minds in the shadows who make sure their wings hold. She had once said, "You don't win wars by waiting for permission." It was the motto of her life, etched into every part she touched. The pilots had called her reckless. The bureaucrats had called her insubordinate. History at last called her right. When you stand before one of those displays today, when you look at that tiny ring of metal under museum light, you can almost hear it. The hum of a Merlin engine, fed by courage, disciplined by physics, lifted by faith. The sound of Britain refusing to fall. Tilly Schilling never built monuments. She built endurance. And in a world that forgets too quickly, that may be the greatest victory of all.